sadness, and frustration for many of us, since we were in the midst of a war which we did not want, nor did we think was necessary. Any hope that peace would come without further destruction and devastation was gone. And in reflecting back even further along the way of the previous 6 months, I realized that there had been other times when there was a mood of despair. On November 29th, when sanctions were imposed with a short 6-week deadline. Throughout the month of December, when the word war became a common word, a common vocabulary for many of our world leaders. On January 9th, when talks failed in Switzerland between Iraq and the United States. And then on the evening of July 16th, when our radio and television programs were interrupted to tell us that war had started and we began to hear the real story of war. Optimism in the ability of our world leaders, I think, has really diminished a great deal in the last 6 or 8 months. However, in the midst of my pessimism, I find hope in people like many of you who are here tonight and who have shared day after day in the frustrations that we experience in the war, but also who participated in many nonviolent activities throughout. And that is what I think Muriel Sibley is all about for me, and I think I can speak for the people who are here tonight. She and her nonviolent stand of responding to the opportunity to witness for peace in an extraordinary way has given me hope. Not that her particular stance will stop wars or change the world we live in, but she gives me hope in that her action and her willingness to share herself with us can change in many ways each one of us. That is what Muriel's presence at the Peace Camp has done for me. It has been part of the change. It has made a difference in my life. Her symbolic action tells us that not only are there things worth living for, but there are also things putting one's life on the line for, and that too is what makes life worth living. Although I most likely will never do what Muriel did, her witness to peace gives me courage and inspiration. Her message is that there is much to be done, and there is much that can be done in the name of real peace. And finally, Muriel said to me today that the people at the Peace Camp were just ordinary people, she said, just like I am. However, I do think there is something of the extraordinary in Muriel Sibley. So I'd like to introduce you.
Thank you, Mary. I'll have to deny that. I'll go back to my first position, which is that I am an ordinary person. I want to share with you tonight my own personal experience because that's all I can share with you. I'm not an expert on Middle East studies. I'm not an expert on war and peace. I didn't know very much about the Middle East before I went there, though I had done a little bit of traveling in Iran and Turkey. I come with really nothing to offer you, but what I went through previous to my going, personally, and what I experienced while I was there, and my own feelings about that particular war and war in general.
Is it on? Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay.
Let me just move it over a little closer. It does help. Thank you.
My feelings about war in general and about peace and what people can do. And probably in that I share with you some ideas, and I would like to perhaps elicit discussion from you too about what we can all do. I feel that we're at a really crucial time in this year because of this war, which I think brought us really to the brink of a possible World War III. And the situation now in the Middle East is, I feel, very tenuous and very fragile, and it's now that we can begin to build a world, hopefully, where this World War III can't happen. Can you hear me up there at the top? Okay. As Mary said, probably a lot of us went through many emotions over the last 8 months or so. Disbelief was one of mine. I could not believe that people would deliberately set out to make a war. There didn't seem to be any other possibility in Mr. Bush's mind. I watched the war begin to build from the time that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait with an enormous disbelief. This surely was not the first time one country had invaded another country. I could remind Mr. Bush of a few incidents in his own personal past. Many times there have been small countries invaded by large countries, and Mr. Bush or his predecessors have not even raised an eyebrow. Many times they've even assisted. Canada was a shadow, I felt, always after the United States in these last few months. I wondered where our government was. The United States was bad enough building up toward this war, but what can you say about a government that didn't even make its own decisions, which just followed behind? So my feelings went from disbelief to horror to despair. What could we do? How could we stop this juggernaut? I heard on the radio in early December an interview with Jean Drèze. He's a young Belgian economist who's been teaching at the London School of Economics in recent years. He was being interviewed as a kind of personal interest story, I think, and he is a terribly interesting man. He's well respected as an economist, did an important study apparently on women and poverty in India, and as a professor at the London School of Economics seemed to have a very smooth and steady career in front of him. He began quickly changing that image of himself by giving away his entire salary to charity and living with the poor on the streets of London. He started to organize the homeless. He unionized them to make sure that they could get their rights. Well, I listened to this man talk and I thought, this is an amazing man. And then he said something even more amazing to me. He said, well, now I have another idea. He said, this terrible war is building, and I think we have to do something to stop it. So some friends and I have decided to start a peace camp, to put it on the border between the two hostile armies. And we're traveling around the world now trying to get as many people as we can from various parts of the world to join us there. I was listening to this radio broadcast with my husband, Cal, and both of us clasped our hands and said, yes, that's it. That's something we could do. That's a positive, tangible action that is working in the opposite direction from this whole snowballing effect of war machinery going into the Middle East. But we couldn't find any information out about it. There wasn't any information given at the end of the interview. I'd missed the beginning of it. In fact, there was no peace camp at that time. It was still an idea. But over the next couple of months, I held that idea in my mind. And when I went away for Christmas back to Minnesota, where my mother lived, I asked a friend in the peace movement to see if he could find out through his network anything more about this peace camp. When I got back in early January, Phil said he'd got a phone number for me. I called the phone number and talked to someone in London who said yes, there was a camp. It had opened on December 24th. There were about 35 people there. She had talked to several hundred people around the world who were interested in coming. She was encouraging as many to come as possible. I said, can you take me? I don't have much experience. I don't have any great skills. She said, we'll take anyone. So then Cal and I talked about this. One of us, we decided right away, would go. We had to pay our own way. We had just enough money in the bank account to do that. One of us should stay home to take care of the kids. We have 5 between us. And we have the whole catastrophe besides that, the house, the dog. So then the next step was to consult with our Quaker meeting. Quakerism has a long tradition of doing sometimes funny things, according to the rest of the world. Quaker women have a tradition of being very involved, of making decisions and of doing things on their own, a lot of times against what's considered correct policy of polite society. If you remember, back in the early days of the United States, there was a ban on Quakers coming into Massachusetts. There were several Quaker women from England who thought it would be only right to test this ban to try to get it repealed. And several of them went back and back and back into Massachusetts. And finally, one of them was hanged, Mary Dyer. So this is a long tradition in Quakerism. I wasn't looking forward to being hanged or anything like it. But I felt this tradition, this past behind me in support. And when we went to our Quaker meeting, we said, this is what we have decided to do. Can you support us in any way? So our friends asked us the good questions. Have you thought about what this is going to mean to the family when you're away, one of you? Have you thought about what would happen if you didn't come back? Have you made wills? They didn't ask me if I'd cleaned my study. It's funny the things you think about when you're making major decisions. I had one commission which I knew was outstanding and which I was afraid I wouldn't be able to complete before I left if I did leave. And it hung at the back of my mind like fire. But they said they would support us. And they gave us a lot of moral support that evening. And the next morning I announced to the, no, not the next morning, a couple of mornings later. First I told the children. No, first before that, Cal and I had to decide who was going to go. It almost came to a coin toss. We both felt very strongly about it. We both have been active partners in our marriage and in our business. We each felt that we could leave the other behind with business and children quite comfortably. We each felt that we would like to go. Finally, we pulled out our passports, and mine was still valid. Then we approached the children. There are 5 of them. They range in age from 11 to 22. It's a blended marriage, blended family. And when we first told them, they were absolutely horrified. They had been following the war along with us, of course, and had known what our reactions were, and had been equally involved in listening and wondering about this whole buildup of the military there. So there were quite a few tears on everybody's part. My eldest son, who's not a child, who's 22 years old now, took me aside and quoted Milton at me. Have you ever thought, Mom, he said, that they also serve who only stand and wait? I said, Nick, I have thought about that. In fact, I've thought about that many times in my life. And I've been standing and waiting a long time. And now I think it's time that I take a more active stance. And he said, I thought you'd say that. The younger children were perhaps most visibly upset. They cried a lot. They hugged a lot. They said, isn't there anything else you can do? And I said, I've thought and thought. I don't know what else I can do. And I feel I have to do this. And I said, I'm doing it for you, actually, if you want to get right down to it. I'm doing it for you and all the children in the world, because I think all the children in the world are at risk right now. So after a couple of days of this kind of talking, and we talked most of every day for 2 days, the children said, all of them individually at various times, I support you, I understand what you're doing. With that kind of support behind me, it was almost easy to make a really tough decision. So then I announced at the Sunday morning in my Quaker meeting that I had decided to go. And by late afternoon, I had almost half the money raised that I would need to have. Within 3 or 4 days after that, I was on a plane to Boston, where I met up with a group of American volunteers, and we had 3 days of orientation in Boston. This included a very swift and skimpy history of the Middle East and Arab culture, some intense group dynamics, consensus building techniques, a few crazy kind of demonstrations of what happens when you're dropped in the desert and you have to find your way out with only a candle and a compass or something like that. I don't remember any of those instructions. And then suddenly we were on another plane. I was telling Mary this evening about how unconsciously we absorb attitudes in our culture about other cultures. In front of me on the plane there was a young Arab father, I think Jordanian, traveling alone with a year-old baby. never seen anything so tender and careful and thoughtful as that young father with his baby. He fed it, he changed it, he played with it, he rocked it for 16 hours until we got to Amman. And I thought, boy, you know, even already, I've already absorbed some of those images of fierce and hostile Arabs, and this doesn't fit the image. We got to Baghdad and finally transferred to a bus and drove overland to the peace camp about 8 hours. It's was located on the border, just inside the Iraqi border, about 300 miles southwest of Baghdad, about 300 miles north of Kuwait, and about 200 miles south of Jordan. The reason it was on the Iraqi side of the border was because the Saudis would not give us a place on the other side. The peace team, a group of about 10 of the original team, had been negotiating since the beginning of December with both the Saudi government and the Iraqi government, asking for a space, one on each side of the border, to put the peace camp. The Saudis had been unforthcoming, even though negotiations went right up to the day the war broke out. We were forced to be content with a camp on the Iraqi side, realizing that it did put us at risk in a public relations way, and people have accused us of being Iraqi supporters. From the very beginning, our policy statement has gone out to the press and to the public saying we are non-aligned, we do not support the Iraqi policies, we do not support the policies of the coalition at this point. We believe in a peaceful settlement of this conflict and all conflicts. We decry the human rights abuses that have taken place in the Middle East. Ah, we finally got it. And all human rights abuses that are ongoing. Can you still hear me? Okay. So with this policy statement being sent out, we had to be content and hope that people would understand our motives and accept what we were doing. The Iraqi government officials who dealt with us were very kind people. There were 2 men and 1 woman who dealt specifically with us, helping us find places to buy food, buy equipment, telling us where we could do this, arranging for transportation, which we rented buses to come back and forth between the camp and Baghdad when we had to do errands. All this kind of thing had been actually happening before I got there, from the time the camp opened on December 24th. I and the American volunteers and a bunch of people from Holland and a few people from Germany and a few other people from Britain and a whole lot of other people arrived on the early morning of the 15th, the day of the official deadline, the end of the sanctions. We were met warmly by those at the camp and went immediately to bed, it being about 2 in the morning, and slept through the night in these tents. The peace camp was given to us or loaned to us by the Iraqi government. It had been an old pilgrim camp. I think it was still currently used as a pilgrim camp during times of pilgrimage for people who came from east of Iraq, traveling by car, sometimes by camel, on their way to Mecca. It was a huge enclosure with a fence surrounding it for protection for animals and for protection for possessions and people. It had enormous big metal roofs on stakes with empty sides so that the air could blow through, but the metal roofs would keep off the sun during the summer and the rain during the winter. And we set up our huge tents underneath these enormous roofs. Sometimes the place looked to me like a concentration camp, but I imagined it full of camels and donkeys and squalling babies and hundreds of people on their way to do probably the most important thing in their lives, and I was comforted by that image. 2 days after I arrived, and those 2 days were full of meetings with everybody. We had to get to know the people who were there quite quickly because we had to build a community right away. 2 days after that, we were in our tents again asleep, and at 2:30 in the morning, an enormous noise started, a great wall of sound that pressed us into the earth like something physical. And immediately we woke up, leapt out of our beds, our sleeping bags on the ground, and realized that the war had started. There could be no other explanation. We rushed out to the perimeter of the camp and sat on the desert and clutched each other, there's no other word for it, in little groups, and wept because we were full of sadness and at that point probably despair. We heard the planes go over us in wave after wave of sound. I can tell you I've developed a great sympathy with the Innu people since being at that peace camp. There's nothing like that enormous sound that just presses you down. The night wore on. We saw bombs falling in the desert around us. We saw the explosions of light and heard the explosions of sound and felt the ground shake from time to time. But none of the bombs fell on us, and it seemed we were being deliberately missed. So when dawn came, we went to going about our ordinary daily tasks. We made breakfast. We listened to the radio. We found out indeed through Voice of America and Voice of Baghdad, two very truthful outlets, that war had started. Occasionally we picked up the BBC, which wasn't too much better. What we heard was rhetoric. We heard war rhetoric from one side and we heard war rhetoric from the other side. It sounded like video games, actually, is what it sounded like. So we had a really hard time understanding really what was happening. We had no other contact. The bus that had brought us to the camp had gone back on the 16th, and it didn't come back again, but we had tried to arrange for it to come back on Friday. But after the war started, there was no more coming and going, no more contact for us for the rest of the world, with the rest of the world. And so then we had a lot of major decisions to make. This community that we were suddenly stuck with, and at this point it was 73 people from 15 countries, was going to be there who knows how long. We thought it could be months. George Bush said 6 months of war, and everything else he'd said had come to pass. So we thought, well, all right, we have to make major decisions. We have to decide, what do we do if ground war breaks out all around us, if two armies come in and begin fighting right on our territory here? How do we behave as a group? What happens if the Allies come in helicopters to rescue us, and the army posts next door, the Iraqi army, starts shooting at them? What do we do? What do we do if the Iraqis evacuate us? And that's eventually what happened. We had all these things to decide, and it seemed crucial to try to decide them quickly. We didn't know what was going to happen. We thought something could happen any hour, any day. On the other hand, we had to plan for a future that we couldn't see the end of. What if everybody ignored us for months, and we were stuck in the desert for who knows how long? So we began rationing our food. I joined the kitchen committee right on, for a couple of reasons. One of which I think was that I believe in jumping into whatever's there to do, because it usually takes your mind off your own problems. And the other reason was I'd gone up to the kitchen the first day and seen what a mess it was. So I was very busy. I helped construct an oven out of an old filing cabinet that we found that had no door. And we baked bread in it over a fire made from brush and bits of old lumber and things that we found in various corners around the camp. We cooked food for 73 people in big pots like this, stews of dried beans and rice. We cooked them on these tiny little kerosene heaters that were this big and had a row of wicks around that had to be all adjusted to exactly the right level, or they would go out. And just when you thought them adjusted to the right level, they would flare up, and you would be afraid the whole thing would explode, and so you would try to adjust it down again. They were the most ridiculously awful things in the world I've ever used, and I was sure that we were probably going to lose our lives to those little stoves rather than to the war. But somehow we managed to cook 2 meals a day for 10 days, for 2 weeks, on those little stoves for all these people. So we got the kitchen into order, and I felt like, you know, my life was kind of getting into order. We had lots and lots of meetings. As you can imagine, with 73 very strong individuals coming from 15 different countries and as many different cultures and many different languages, making decisions wasn't very easy. We started out trying to do it as a whole group, and then we discovered that it wasn't working. So we split up into affinity groups. Maybe you've heard that term before. We chose people that we thought we could get along with. Sometimes they were our national people. I came over as the single Canadian, so that didn't help me. The Indians tended to talk together, even though they used English as their language, because not all they spoke different dialects. They were from different parts of India. So they had to use English as their language, but they found the Indian English easier to understand than Dutch English or German English or even English. And there was a group of Great Britain people who became an affinity group because they felt close to each other and knew some of them knew each other. There was an affinity group that I was part of that had the ragtag ends of everybody else who didn't fit into any other affinity group. And we found that this was one way that we could manage to make decisions. We would talk about the major problems in our affinity groups and wrestle them out with each other, the 10 or 12 of us in each group, and then we would send a representative to a steering committee who would then take those decisions and work with them and see if they could come up with something for the whole group that they could all decide on. If not, they'd send the whole works back to the affinity groups again and we'd try over again. This was a bit cumbersome, but it seemed the best we could do, and after a while it seemed to be working. We also developed some working groups, a group to take care of the toilet and the septic field. There was a primitive septic field and some working toilets, which worked less and less well as time went on. The Australians did a good job at that, of taking care of the toilet situation. There was a working group to take care of water, to make sure that the water was purified. We had water purification tablets. So in all these different ways, we began building this community, which we had to live with. There were some people we didn't get on with very well. There are always some people in a group who don't mesh too well with a group. And there was nothing else we could do with them. We couldn't get rid of them. We couldn't suggest they join some other society. We couldn't kill them, obviously, though on some occasions it was tempting. We were trying to ration our food. As I said, we were quite concerned that we only had a limited amount of food and we might be there for months. So I was part of the nasty rationing committee. And we set out certain portions to be served to each person per day. And we put aside all the canned goods, of which we had only a small amount, as emergency rations. And then we found that Tim, lovely Tim, who was a plumber from Britain and who had the temperament of a 2-year-old, he was sweet and friendly and happy and cheerful and impervious to anybody's opinion, was feeding our tuna to the cats. This was this kind of thing we had to deal with, you see. Well, in most places you could tell Tim to get lost, but this was not an option at the peace camp. And it was very good for us to figure out ways of bringing Tim into the community. What was he good at? We found out he was a good letter writer. We started getting him to draft letters which we would eventually send to people in power, telling them what we thought of the world. And he was excellent at this, and he started bending his energies to this, and I think he gave up feeding the cats. At any rate, he began to understand the problem a little better. So in these different ways, we found out that all these people from all these cultures with all these language barriers could come together. And the point of all this, I think, is clear, that we have hope for the world at large still. On the 10th day after the war started, we were again in our sleeping bags. It was again 2 in the morning. And we heard big vehicles rumble into the camp. Now the bombing went on every night while we were there, so we were constantly being woken by noises. But this was a different noise. And it became clear that this was an evacuation. We rushed outside and were told that the Iraqis were evacuating us for our own safety. We told them we didn't consider them responsible for our safety, that we hadn't come there to be safe in the first place, and that we would prefer to stay, thank you very much. And they said it was not an option. They were very kind but very firm, and said that they were following orders only. We were to be taken away from the border and sent out of the country. So we packed up our belongings. Some people resisted nonviolently. I did not join that group, not feeling moved at that point to do so. But there were people who felt that they had to make this last statement, and they sat down on the ground and refused themselves to voluntarily get on the buses. There was an interesting little connection with this particular incident. I had been helping to load the kitchen stuff onto the trucks. And when I got on the bus, and I was the last person on the bus, except for the Iraqi official who was going to accompany it, he came up to a woman who sat behind me, whom I knew had been one of the resistors. And he knelt down beside her, and he put his arms around her neck. She was a woman in her 60s, and a fairly heavy woman, and he had carried her to the bus, apparently. He said, "I'm sorry, Mama." The Iraqis call older women Mama. He said, "I had to do it, you know." And she said, "It's all right, but I had to do what I had to do." And that was a very moving moment for me to hear. And another human face of war. People are caught up in war. Ordinary people are caught up in war. But they're the same kind of people that you and I are. And those men were working for a government, whether they approved of it or not. They were working at a job that they were doing the best they could at. Their job was to take care of us, to make sure we were safe, to get us out of the country, and they did it very, very well. We became very fond of them, and I think they became fond of us. We never pressed them on their political ideas, because in a dictatorship you don't push people. I felt that probably they could not condone Saddam Hussein, but I sensed that they were proud in a way that Iraq was standing up to the Western powers. Certainly I got this verbally from people in Jordan when we finally got to Jordan. We were in Baghdad for 4 nights and 3 days. During that time, we saw a great deal of hardship in the city. The city had been without electricity since the first day of the war, when the electric plant had been bombed. The hotel had a small generator which it used to operate the kitchen. There were still delegations coming to Baghdad, still peace delegations. There was an Iranian delegation there trying to talk to Saddam Hussein when we were there, so there were a few Iranians staying at the hotel. There was CNN at the hotel. This was the Al Rashid. But aside from a few people like that, a few foreigners, there were very few other people. Our contingent was the largest one. We were about 80 people, because there had been some people caught in Baghdad on the way to the camp or on the way back from it when the war started. And we met up with them when we went back to Baghdad. In the hotel, it was pitch dark. There was no electricity. We found our way around the corridors with candles and flashlights. There was 1 hour of cold water a day, sometimes. And I knew that in the rest of Baghdad there was no water. Our meals were very scanty, but beautifully prepared. The kitchen staff was still being kept on. Beautifully prepared and presented, but not very much food. We had one poor fellow from New York who was about 6'2" and 22 years old, who was always hungry. A lot of us gave him our extra chapatis and dinner rolls. It was strange to feel that one was deprived oneself, and yet to realize in the city around one, people were far more deprived and under a great deal more hardship. We had some freedom to walk around in the city. We were told that we could go places if we went in groups of 4 or 5 and took one of the Iraqis with us as guides. They had instructions, I believe, not to let us go into certain areas of the city, but other areas were all right. We had a few group trips, one to the famous milk factory. I must say I missed the boat on that one. I was in the backyard when the bus left. But I understand from the people who went that it seemed quite obvious it was a milk factory. The smell of sour milk was everywhere. Those of us in our group who were engineers and people of mechanical background said they couldn't see how bacteriological warfare could be constructed in such a place. The milk factory, incidentally, was in the middle of a dairy cooperative. There was another trip to a hospital. I willingly declined going to that one. I don't like rubbernecking at people who are suffering, and I felt I could imagine it well enough. The people who went said that it was a sad situation, the main problem being lack of water. I understand now this is 10-fold, 100-fold worse. There was another trip on which I happily went, and that was to downtown Baghdad. We were dropped off by the bus and told to come back to the bus in an hour. So we wandered around, looked at the shopping district, most of which was shut up. The small shops were bolted and barred. Their owners had gone elsewhere to be safe. There were a few street vendors on the street selling local produce, a few tiny shops open, not appearing to do any business. There were a few people on the street, not a great many, soldiers standing around on street corners looking a little bored. We never got a hostile look that I saw or that anybody in our group experienced, never a hostile word. People looked at us curiously and sometimes with great friendliness. When they had enough English to ask who we were and we told them, they responded with enormous warmth and thanks. Women who didn't speak English nevertheless held their babies up to wave at us. I was stopped on the street by a couple of schoolgirls who were dressed in the long chadors that covered them from head to toe but had their pretty little faces staring out. And they stopped me and pointed to my T-shirt and my jeans. We were all dressed in camp clothes all the time. And then they opened their chadors to show me their T-shirts and jeans underneath. Again, we didn't talk politics with anybody in Iraq. We said that we were there because we wanted the war to stop. We believed in peace. We believed there could be peace. We believed that the Iraqi people were the same as the Canadian people or the German people, the French people, the New Zealand people, and we all wanted peace. We got complete agreement from everyone on that. We were taken out of Baghdad on the 31st of January and arrived in Jordan on the 1st of February. The road that we went over was the main road from Jordan to Baghdad. It had been heavily bombed. They were not bombing it during the daytime at that point, so we left early in the morning and we got to the border by dusk. But the bomb craters were huge, and we had to detour into the desert around them many times. We saw many vehicles that had been bombed. Many of them were obviously commercial vehicles. They could have been used, I suppose, for carrying army equipment or something like that, but there was no obvious evidence of that. There were also passenger cars. There were also the Jordanian oil tankers, which had just been bombed the morning we set out, and they were still burning. Those Jordanian oil tankers were supposed to be unembargoed. There was an agreement by the United Nations that Jordan could continue to import oil from Iraq, and this was flagrantly abused. When we got to Jordan, we were treated very kindly by the royal family. We had an audience with the Crown Prince and his wife, and we said that we would like to set up the peace camp now in Jordan, which we considered the next border, really, because it was next to Israel, between Israel and Iraq, because of the huge number of Palestinians that lived there and the bitterness of the Arab world about the Palestinian situations. We felt that a peace camp in Jordan would be a good next symbol of the need for reasonable resolution to conflict. The Crown Prince and his wife said that they would work on that and they would like to support it. I understand that this peace camp is now being set up. I stayed in Jordan for a week and helped to organize the next idea, which was that we would try to accompany the medical goods that had been held up in Jordan since the beginning of the war, which were supposed to be also sent to civilians in Iraq and Kuwait, and were not considered to be embargoed by the United Nations resolution. Nevertheless, they had not made it to Iraq because the generals in the coalition had stated publicly that anything on that road was considered fair game. And the Red Crescent Society, which is, you know, as the sister society of the Red Cross, had been afraid to send the trucks out. So the peace team decided this would be a worthy cause to help with. And we wrote letters to the U.S. Defense Department and the British Defense Department, and we wrote letters to the Iraqis, and we talked to people at UNICEF and to the Red Crescent and said we would like to offer a human shield to the first convoy of medical goods going to Iraq. And this was accepted by the Red Crescent, and UNICEF gave their support. And the U.S. Defense Department wrote back and said, we recommend that you do not do this highly dangerous activity. We cannot guarantee the safety of that road. And we wrote back to them and said, the reason that road is not safe is because you are bombing it. And if you will stop bombing it for 3 days, we can get these unembargoed medical goods in to people who need them. And we got another letter back saying, we're sorry, we see that you are very sincere people, but we consider this road to be unsafe and highly recommend that you do not travel on it. So the first medical convoy went off. By a bureaucratic mistake, the peace team members were held up at the border, and the convoy went off without them finally. But all the publicity had gone off, and the media had been notified in all the countries of all the people who were supposed to accompany this team, And in fact, the road was not bombed for those 3 days. The war was won 3 days later. I use "won" in quotation marks because I don't believe any war is ever won. There is an enormous need for those medical supplies still. I can hardly bear to even think about the suffering that's caused by some of these games that are played by men in power. I say men because they all are men now. Margaret Thatcher was there a while ago, though. I see a vision of men sitting at their tables, their mahogany tables, and playing with counters and making their strategic moves and having their games. And the lives they're playing with are their own children's lives. And it was for this reason that I felt I personally had to do something. Somehow, we have to make this a more equitable world. It's the poor, always, who suffer. When we make war in another country, we usually don't kill the top banana. We usually kill all the little people who had nothing to do with the causes of the war. When we fight with our armies are not usually composed of our upper middle class or our wealthy young men and women. They're the poor men and women, youngsters, most of them, who haven't had a chance to even think about life and the great questions of life, who go off to kill other youngsters. On the plane back from Jordan, I sat next to a Kuwaiti boy who's being sent by his family to safety in the United States. He was about 18 years old, and his eyes filled frequently with tears as we talked. He said, the Iraqis came into Kuwait and devastated. He said, so many terrible things happened. And then he said, and then the coalition forces began bombing the city, and it got worse and worse. He said, my country is being destroyed. I hope that his family survived. I hope that perhaps he will be able to go back to a new and rebuilt Kuwait. But my heart cries out for the people of Iraq because they have no money to rebuild as the Kuwaitis have. The Gulf Peace Team is trying to collect money, and I'm going to dun you for it tonight because there is an enormous need. The coalition forces are not putting money into rebuilding Iraq. People are dying there by the hundreds every day. I just read a statistic which came out from Jordan from the peace team saying that the normal mortality rate in hospitals are 5%, is 5%. It's now well over 25%. There's still a great lack of clean water. There's a great lack of anesthetics. A report from a doctor who was working there who got back to Jordan, he said he had to do amputations with no anesthetics. There are going to be a lot of deaths from shock as a result of this. I feel that now is the time when we need to work for peace. During the war, it was very important, and many of us were impelled to do things that perhaps we'd never done before. But now is the time when maybe we can make a climate and a country and a world where this won't happen again. We have a great responsibility in our own country to demand truth, number one, from our leaders, and to demand accountability. When you vote for in your next election, look up the voting records of the people you vote for. Don't listen to what they say on the campaign trail. How have they voted in the past on all the issues that are important to you? Go by that. I understand that there's a peace center that's been set up in Halifax just today. That's a wonderful idea. I hope marvelous things can happen at that peace center to keep people's minds focused on the fact that peace is built one tiny step at a time from now on. There's a Voice of Women here in Halifax, and I know a lot of you belong to it. There are other organizations where people gain support and help from one another to work for causes that they believe in. This is something else we need to all do. We need to be very creative at this point in thinking of what we can do so that this kind of tragic waste of life doesn't happen again. Well, I've gone on quite a long time, and perhaps I'll ask you if you have any questions or would like to get any discussion going among yourselves. And thank you for your attention.
While Muriel is answering any questions you may have, she did say that what she wanted to do tonight was to ask people for some donations to the Gulf Peace Team. So we have a rather interesting looking sack here that Donna Smith is going to pass around. And anything you wish to give, please do so. It is money that will be given for medical, to buy medical supplies to send into Baghdad. And that, as Muriel said, is most needed. So while that is happening, how about some questions? I'm sure Muriel is willing to answer to the best of her ability any questions you have.
One over there, Mary.
Yes.
All the news that I seem to be reading lately is that the Iraqis destroyed Kuwait. Now, did the Americans also destroy Kuwait? Because we don't hear that at all now.
Yes, I understand. Kuwait, not the Americans. It's my understanding that heavy bombing of Kuwait took place during the aerial assault, because there were armies, that's where the main Iraqi army was in Kuwait, on the outskirts and actually in the country itself. So there was heavy bombing of Kuwait. I want to tell you a little joke, which I shared with a few people this afternoon. It's not very funny. But isn't it interesting how jokes arise in conflict and in times of crisis immediately? It's as if they're spawned from the ground. I was told this by some Jordanians, many of whom were Palestinians. They said there was this Kuwaiti man who came to Jordan, and he met up with a Palestinian man, and the Kuwaiti man said, "Oh, my friend, I've had the most terrible experience. My house was burned down, my business taken away from me, my wife was raped, my family is scattered, my life is in pieces." And the Palestinian man said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. Is this your first time?" This demonstrates, I think, a very real truth, and that is that part of this peace that we're going to need to build in the Middle East has got to take care of the Palestinians. They're all over the Middle East. They're in every Arab country. They're stateless still after 48 years. In Kuwait, they were teachers, lawyers, doctors, but never citizens. There were many of them that left Kuwait, that left Iraq, and came back to Jordan. Jordan needs a great deal of support. It needed it during the war and didn't get much. Tried very hard to be neutral. At the same time, took in all the evacuees from Kuwait and from Iraq who were fleeing the area, sent a lot of these foreign nationals back to their home countries at Jordanian expense. Kept many others, has many Palestinians still in permanent refugee camps, which apparently are very well run. Some of the peace team members got out to see them, some of the camps, and said they're very well run. They seem to be quiet, pleasant enough places, but people there don't want to live in refugee camps. And Jordan has very little money. It's a poor country. Jordan was promised millions of dollars by the UN in October or September, I believe, because it was anticipated that many of these evacuees would be coming through Jordan, would need to be sent on or at least taken care of. They haven't seen a penny of that UN money. I think Canada maybe could make a real difference in the Middle East, because Canada has a reputation, God knows how and why, of being a peacekeeping country and of being a friendly country to neutral countries. We haven't been very neutral, we haven't been very peaceful, but for some reason we still seem to have this reputation. If we could build on that reputation and offer help, both financial and moral support, to neutral nations in the Middle East, I think we could go a long way toward peacekeeping. So I would urge that we work on the UN, work on Canada's place in the UN, and each of us think individually, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference at this point? Because it takes a lot from us. I sometimes get quite cross because I have a life I'd like to lead. I have, just like you, I've got family I'd like to spend time with. I've got things I'd like to do, but people go and call these wars on me, and then my life is very disrupted. And if my life is disrupted, you can imagine what the lives are like in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Israel. And that place is a tinderbox still, maybe even more so than it was before because of the enormous amount of bitterness that's left over after this war. So join your Peace Center, support it, join the Voice of Women. How about not paying taxes for war anymore? There's a group here called Conscience Canada. This is a really positive way we can make a statement. People listen to money, funnily enough. And this group called Conscience Canada in Canada here, which you obviously know about, you can give that portion of your taxes that would ordinarily go for war. You can tell the government that you don't believe in paying for war anymore. And you can send it to Conscience Canada's Peace Fund, where it will sit quite safely and happily until such time as the government decides to do something sensible with it. Now, to my understanding, at this point, they haven't collected any of this money. They've sent warning letters to people saying that you're not doing a good thing, keeping back your taxes. Do you disagree? Do you know that people have been collected on?
Yes, I do.
Okay, because I hadn't heard that.
Yes. I'm not able to tell the complete story, but I will say that our good friend Muriel Duckworth was collected on.
Was she?
To spend time in court over this particular issue. We had no idea why they singled her out, except perhaps because she was such a
Well, good. Okay, the more we make an issue out of it, the better, I say. And I think people have to be willing to take a risk now and then, either a monetary risk or other kinds of risks. We ask people to take risks in war, after all, don't we? We send our soldiers off to fight. We say, well, tough luck, kids, you might get killed. Those of us who want to work for peace, and it's far more important, I think have to be willing to take some risks too now and then. Any other discussion, questions, or anything else? Yeah?
I'd like to ask you a personal question, how your children responded during the time that you were away and what they may have gone through.
Yeah, that's an interesting and a valid question.
How they reacted to you when you came back.
Sure. I wasn't here to watch them, but I understand that they held up quite well. My son, who's been very apolitical, the 22-year-old, made a lot of speeches to the media because he was interviewed quite a bit. And I heard a couple of them taped, and he sounded very strong and I was very proud of him. My daughter, who's 16 and who's a little more political but extremely cautious about doing anything that will get her on the outs with her peer group, has suddenly been called a peacenik at school, apparently. And she said, you know, Mom, I don't even mind. So that's a step for her, too. On the other hand, when I got home, that daughter withdrew from me the day after I got home and just went completely away and turned her back on me. When I finally got up enough energy to say, what's going on? She said, I'm mad at you. And I said, oh, yeah. And she said, I started being mad at you about 2 weeks ago. She said, I've been really, really angry because you left. And I said, that's understandable. I said, it happens when people die, too, that kids feel like they've been abandoned. And even adults feel that way. And she said, yeah, I was really mad. She said, I had my life falling apart around me. She said, I had exams coming up and I couldn't study. And I'm pretty sure I flunked biology because of this. And she said, and Tom and I broke up. And you weren't here so I could talk to you about it. And I said, that's right, I wasn't. It would be like as if I had died anyway, wouldn't it? And you had to cope with life on your own. I said, it sounds like you coped, though. I mean, you did get through your exams. You did pass biology. And people break up with boyfriends and get through it. She said, yeah. She said, I guess I'm not mad anymore. And she said, I really do understand why you went. And I really do support you. But I had to let you know how mad I was. So then I took out my youngest daughter for a muffin after school, and I said, how are you doing? And she said, fine. And I said, how are you doing while I was away? And she said, fine. And I said, Bronwyn was mad at me. She said, she was? Why? I said, because I left you all on your own, and I went off and disappeared and maybe wouldn't come back. And she said, but it wasn't your fault. So I said, okay. And she said, you know what really bothered me, though? I said, okay, what? She said, those darn newspaper people, they wanted you to look sad all the time. She said, they always came around with their cameras saying, are you sad about your mom being gone? And I would say sometimes. And they would say, can you look sad so we can take a picture of you? And she said, I don't think that's right. I said, I don't think so either. So a range of reactions, yeah. I will say, too, my friends were mad at me when I got back. Some of my good friends were very angry with me for leaving. And I had some other interesting reactions. One of my friends came up to me when I was speaking in Ottawa, and she said, you've been the cause of a great deal of controversy at my Carleton class. And I said, oh? She said, yes, all the women think that she said all, it probably was an exaggeration. She said, think that you're totally irresponsible for leaving your family, and that your ideas, therefore, can carry no weight, and people can't really pay attention to you because you're so irresponsible. And she said the men were really awful, pardon your feelings here, men, but she said they all seem to agree, and one of the statements made by one of them seems to typify their feelings, and that his statement was, and this is a direct quote, if that were my wife, I'd tie her to the stove. So I think we have a ways to go still here in liberated Canada. I found that hard to believe. I consider that my choices in my life are as valid as a man's choices. And men have been leaving their wives and children to go to war for many years, to go to work, to go have fun, and nobody even questions it. So I think we have to think seriously about that when we feel a little disapproval of a woman who leaves her family to go off and do something that she believes in.
Muriel?
Yes.
Some of us know a good bit about Peace Brigades International and also Witness for Peace. Some of us have participated in those. So we understand witnessing in dangerous situations. Is there anything more you can say about some of the people who were there, young, old, in between, anything you gleaned from why they responded in such numbers, which is quite remarkable?
That's a good question. I thought it was remarkable too, and I thought that was the great strength of this idea, was that these regular folks from all around the world would get together, moved by the power of this notion that they could stand between two armies, and if not stop them, at least put a pause for peace in people's minds around the world. There were all kinds of people there. The youngest one was 19. The oldest one was a woman who was 82, and she used a walker. And there was everybody in between. There were quite a few people in their 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, all the way down. They were from all walks of life. There was Tim the plumber. There was a bus driver from Colorado. There was a receptionist who looked like a Barbie doll with long blonde hair and had never done anything like this before in her life, who hadn't even told her family, her mother and father, that she was leaving because she knew she'd get such flack from them that she probably wouldn't go. Her life was turned upside down by this whole experience. She learned more and grew more, I think, than maybe anybody there. She called me up from Colorado when she got back, and she had been a person who refused to talk to the press, who didn't even like being at meetings. She said she found it too hard to be with people, too hard to talk to people. She didn't have enough words to say. She was too uneducated. Pretty person, you know, really nice person, but she felt very inadequate a lot of the time. She called me up in Victoria from Colorado, and she said, Muriel, I've written a letter to President Bush. Could I read it to you? Tell me if it sounds off the wall. And she read me this beautiful letter. It wasn't always perfectly grammatical, but I had no quarrel with that. It was perfectly wonderful is what it was. It was directly from the heart. It was asking President Bush to think about his own children and grandchildren and how he would feel if they were in danger. And I said, Melissa, that's just marvelous. Mail it off. She said, you really think so? I said, absolutely. She said, I'll tell you something else. I've been thinking maybe I should have a press conference. So, you know, things do move and things do change, and this business of personal witness is much more powerful than we think sometimes. I'll tell you another story. This isn't about someone at the camp. This is a personal experience I had a week ago. I was coming back from Vancouver, where I'd gone to speak to a church group. And on the ferry, I sat next to a woman who was very well dressed and had a briefcase with her. And she looked like a businesswoman of some sort. And she looked at me kind of oddly for a few minutes, and then she said, "Aren't you that woman who went to Iraq?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "That was a strange thing to do." And I said, "Well, it probably was. But this is why I did it." And we talked, and she asked quite a few questions, and I told her just about my whole experience, and we went off and had a breakfast together on the ferry and coffee. And finally, I said, getting away from that subject, I said, "What do? You look like you're going on business over to Victoria." She said, "Yes, I'm a perfume salesperson." She said, "It sounds a little frivolous, doesn't it?" And I said, "Well, no, not really." I said, "We need beauty and wonderful aesthetic experiences in life, and perfume can be part of that." I said, "Besides, you know, it's really such an exciting time for cosmetics now, with people developing non-hurtful ways of making cosmetics, and natural perfumes coming out, natural oils." And I said, there could be some wonderful developments along this line. She said, "You know, you're right." And she said, "I have noticed that there are things like that happening. That could be a line that would be interesting to follow." She said, "I'll think about that." And then she said, "Thank you very much for talking to me. It's meant a tremendous amount to me to talk to you today, and I'll never forget it." And from her first attitude to her last one, I think there had been an enormous chasm crossed in her life. And this has happened to me more than once. And I think of all those 73 people who were at the camp from all those countries, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, Austria, Germany, Italy, France, England, Canada, Brazil, Greece, probably a lot of others. I can't remember off the tip of my tongue. And each person went back and each person talked to other people. And it's almost incalculable, the number of ripples that have gone out and the distance they've traveled. So I would say to you, don't worry about whether you're making a big enough splash. Just realize that it's going to move outward.
Muriel, thank you so much. You've really touched all our hearts. And on behalf of Mount Saint Vincent University and Voice of Women and the Metro Peace Action Network, we do thank you for being here. I believe you're going straight on now back across the country.
Well, I'm
Via Wolfville.
Wolfville first,
Via,
yeah.
of course, in
Yeah,
Wolfville.
yeah.
But then heading back across the country.
Stopping in Toronto on the way.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Very fine. I want to say that back in 1951, Muriel Sibley, very well-known Quaker and intellectual university professor in the States, Muriel Sibley, who was Muriel's father, and Gunnar Peterson, who was my husband, and our families were together directing an international student seminar, foreign student seminar, for the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And I haven't seen Muriel for 40 years. And it's wonderful. And Muriel, you've come a long way, baby. From 6 or 7 years old. That's really quite amazing. I'd like to put in a few plugs here. Thank you for mentioning the Peace Center. We did open today. I think there are quite a few of you out there that were not able to come, and I invite you to come down to Gottingen Street next to the Micmac Native Friendship Center. You mentioned Conscience Canada. The Peace Action Network and Voice of Women and others are going to be starting a withholding war tax campaign beginning very soon, and I want to invite any of you to come to the Peace Center next Tuesday night when we're going to be holding a meeting and talking about withholding from the federal government in Canada our 8.6% that goes directly to war taxes. It's about time that we resist in some way, because we know they no longer want people's bodies, they want our money for high-tech war. And so invite anyone to come at 7:30 tomorrow night. I think maybe that's about it. And thank you so much again, Muriel.
Thanks for having me.
Something to give you on behalf of Mount Saint Vincent University.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'd just like to thank a few people who helped so much in making this event come to fruition this evening. First of all, our Office of the Academic Vice President, with its very generous contribution for bringing Muriel Sibley here from Vancouver. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors at the Mount, particularly the Institute for the Study of Women, and a few people who represent, I see somebody here tonight, Robbie McGinn, who is in the Institute, who distributed posters forever and ever for us and hung them everywhere, pamphlets and so forth. And also I'd like to thank another member of that staff, Maurice Michaud, who I don't think is here tonight. Is he? No, Maurice isn't here. Maurice made a poster so quickly that it appeared in, I think, a matter of 24 hours, finished and ready to go to press, at which time our printing office then in 24 hours reproduced everything for us. And so there was a lot of cooperation and help from the Mount, from the Voice of Women, and from the Metro Peace Action Committee, who helped us distribute and publicize this event all over Halifax. So I thank each and every one of you. And now I would like to, and also Betty, I would like, and all of you from the new Peace Center, I'd like to congratulate you on the opening of that Peace Center this evening. I'm sorry we couldn't be there, but we'll be there tomorrow night for the meeting with Muriel.
Oh, I didn't mention that, please.
Tomorrow night at the Peace Center, all right, here's another advertisement. Muriel Sibley will be at the Peace Center tomorrow evening. The focus group for that evening will be the Quakers. Anyone who would like to come is invited to join us at 7:30?
7:30, Peace Center.
At the Peace Center on Gottingen Street. And now I would like to invite all of you to come over to the Institute for the Study of Women, that lovely White House. If you don't know where it is, just follow the crowd for refreshments and to meet Muriel Sibley. So thank you for coming.
Oh, what a story. It's very moving, very moving.
Thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was Deborah Koff, yes. I did. See you.
This bag of money. It's my camera bag. We forgot the bear, the other.
Good heavens.
Can you come over?
How can you do that?
What?
$400.
The university.
Good heavens.
Thank you, Muriel. I've come